Wow, I find this conference to be intellectually exhilarating and emotionally devastating. I want to talk to you today, I want to continue the conversation that Michael and others have begun and talk about the future of instructional opportunity for underemployed and poorly educated American adults. I want to talk about instructional opportunities for underemployed and poorly educated American adults. These are the people who were systematically exploited by the for-profit college universe over the last 15 years and extracted our tax money for their corporate benefit. And these are also, I think, very important for purposes today. These are people for whom there is no established philanthropic constituency. I have a faculty appointment in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. It is easy to raise money for early childhood education, K-12 improvement education, educational technology for anybody who is in the midst of adolescence or younger. There is no philanthropic constituency for underemployed adult Americans. And even 7 years into the world, the conversation that was created with so-called MOOC mania in 2012, there is still no philanthropic constituency for the men and women who are most disadvantaged in the conversations that we're having today. And furthermore, I want to suggest that the role of the Harvards and Rices and Stanfords of the country, the spectacularly well-endowed private research universities, who have not in any recent period thought about underemployed adults as part of their service constituency, have yet to be asked to assist the country in figuring out the future of the educational opportunities for those Americans. I can say that at least at Stanford, the doors and windows are open for potential assistance in helping us figure out what role we might play for the future of underemployed, poorly educated adults. But I have a hard time getting people to believe that Stanford might actually be interested in these constituencies. So one of the things I want to be, one of the reasons I flew out here this time is I wanted to be sure that as many people as possible know that there is one well-funded research university that is interested in finding partners to seek solutions to this problem. We are, at least at the moment, tax-exempt organizations in the public service. We probably owe the rest of the country more than they get from our privilege, but we're still waiting for opportunities. All right. I want to take some things as oh, I'm supposed to tell you who I am. I've written some books. I'm an academic. I'm a political scientist and a sociologist. For the last 10 years, I've been studying the changing relationships between universities and government. We're about 30 years in to a gradual process of recapitalization of the entire post-secondary sector, away from a model in which higher education was presumed to be largely but not exclusively a project of government, a project of regional placemaking and nation-state building, to one in which post-secondary education is increasingly presumed to be a consumer good, essentially, and a commoditized product that people are purchasing in ever more competitive markets. That process has been underway for 30 years. Like I said, but it's taken on clearly crisp new resonances with the recent presidential administration. Here's another book that I did not author, but I strongly encourage you to take a look at by my colleagues at Stanford, Michael Kirst and Dick Scott, called Higher Education in Silicon Valley, which is an ecological analysis of the evolution of the post-secondary sector in the sexiest regional economy in the United States over the last 40 years. And demonstrates, among many other things, the extent to which the inherited post-secondary sector has responded extraordinarily slowly to the dynamic changes in Northern California's regional economy. And we're essentially running on fumes and imported labor for the region's sort of spectacular success at present. So it's a good snapshot, I think, of the current world that we're inheriting. Here are some things I want to take as given. These are going to be easy to take as given in this room. One, that there are more frequent occupational and life transitions that all of us are going to be facing going forward, that there's more economic uncertainty and competition for relative advantage in the nation and the world going forward, and that there's going to be a growing supply of lifelong learning credential opportunities provided both by institutions like my own and by a whole new kinds of organization that are not necessarily schools, providing lots of different instructional opportunities. Smiley face question mark on my view. What I do not take as given, that there will be a shared understanding across the American polity about all of the changes that we hear about every time we go to a Future of Work conference. Okay? I do not take as given that there will be equitable mechanisms for maintaining employability over the course of entire lives. And I do not assume that there will be reasonable distribution of information and risks in markets for lifelong learning and credentials. Okay? Now, I'm no economist, but I'm smart enough to see that the current US post-secondary market sector is a complicated market, and there's excellent empirical and theoretical and historical work on the peculiarities of this sector. It's got a wide variety of providers, some 5,000 post-secondary colleges and universities in the United States, growing quite rapidly. Only a very small proportion of post-secondary providers, not a small proportion, a smaller proportion than you might imagine of post-secondary providers are even captured in current state and federal data systems. Kirsten Scott found that there are about 350 degree-granting institutions in the 7-county San Francisco Bay Area, and about 150 of those are listed in iPads. So in terms of data, this is a Wild West. And David, you're sitting right in front of my timer. So there we go. The timer moved, so now we're cool. Thanks. I didn't want to blame you for my going over. We've got a wide variety of providers, great organizational fertility and flexibility and entrepreneurship. This is definitely an entrepreneurial tradition from the colonial era forward. We've got a categorical tiering by admission selectivity and institutional wealth and prestige, a tiering that has only gotten broader and more categorical over the last 40 years, exactly coextensive with the categorical tiering of the class structure in the United States. So Stanford is less like the rest of the country than it was even 15 years ago. We have a whole ecosystem that is substantially and diffusely subsidized by government. Every palm tree, every blade of grass at my esteemed institution is underwritten severally and iteratively by state and federal governments.
Every Applewood toilet.
Excuse me? Every Applewood toilet. Do we have Applewood toilets? Oh, okay, great. Yeah, that is at the moment tax exempt as well. And it's a sector that is driven by substantial information asymmetries between suppliers and consumers. In fact, the elite sector is driven by those information asymmetries. That's kind of what we purvey. Now, markets are no mere technical and administrative affairs. They're also culturally and emotionally rich and complex as well. And there's a great body of work in economic anthropology and economic sociology that has worked to sort of surface that cultural and emotional complexity. Let me give you just a couple of examples. This is the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, which I had the pleasure of visiting a few years ago. It's one of the most storied and celebrated and most carefully ethnographically studied markets in the world. On the inside, it looks kind of like this. It's really quite spectacular and a rich phenomenological experience. It's full of people like this guy. Who don't by no means let the goods sell themselves. We talked earlier about customer service. You could call what these guys do service, but it certainly is an elaborate narrative project of convincing you that the particular objects that they are selling are unlike any other items in the market by virtue of their special access to peculiar knowledge, and special suppliers. You're especially lucky that you happen to walk by this particular vendor at this particular time. In fact, people often take these markets and the participation in them so seriously that they will overcome the market asymmetry by hiring a guide or an expert to help them find exactly the right rug or tapestry or piece of jewelry. Now, we don't have markets like this very often in American life anymore. Most of our marketplaces, at least the brick and mortar ones, look more like this. And in these kinds of markets, as the architectural historians Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown pointed out years ago in their classic book, Learning from Las Vegas, in markets like this, hi Kevin, the sensual and interactive features of the Grand Bazaar are replaced by packaging, right? So it's the colors and the symbology and the narratives that are associated with, that are produced by Madison Avenue that do the work that the men and women in the Grand Bazaar do for a living. And of course, we know that that those markets are categorized and tiered to appeal to to consumers who have different tastes and proclivities and expertise. Certainly, the appearance of the packages varies, but also their strategic positioning in the physical marketplace to best attract the desires of the intended audience. These are just a couple of markets that have very different, they have very different sort of emotional and informational characteristics. In the spirit of some of the scenario planning that we talked about earlier, if we do nothing for the lifelong learning marketplace, what kind of market will we get, right? We inherit a post-secondary sector that is organized as a market. If it will, in the near future, be regulated by government only less than it is presently. There's a great deal of organizational fertility and fecundity in this domain and ever-growing amounts of venture capital going in the lifelong learning space. So whether or not we, again, and I hope someone calls me out the way I called out Heather McGowan, who this we is that floats around in our discussions, if nobody in this room does nothing, what kind of lifelong learning marketplace are we likely to get? And I would suggest that the evolution of the sector suggests that we'll get a lifelong learning marketplace that is a mixture of that and that. Why do I think that? Because that's the lifelong learning marketplace we currently have. At the high end, we have institutions like the one I am fortunate enough to work at who say, trust us. We've been doing this a long time. We have sourced the world for the best experts and teachers, and we have assembled just exactly the right curriculum for your son or daughter. Don't ask us for numbers, because we don't measure any of this stuff, right? But trust us, because it's beautiful and emotionally compelling, and we have very strong reputations. At the other end of the market, right, we have essentially a commercial advertising-driven sector in which there is, if anything, there's no less information asymmetry, but the trust us is governed by an elaborate advertising campaigns, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who has at least almost shed a tear when watching the University of Phoenix television commercials. So I strongly suspect that if we do nothing, we're going to get some amalgam of these two markets for lifelong learning going forward. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. What might a less asymmetrical market for lifelong learning credentials look like? I recently purchased one of these, and I don't know anything about these. I have lots of ideas and feelings about them, but I don't know anything about the engineering of cars. I don't even like to drive. Now, I'm happy to report that that when I looked at new cars, they had these stickers on them that had remarkably consistent information about the relative safety and mileage and cost of operation for these cars. Now, this was brought to you by that federal government that's just so unfashionable at present, right? I mean, we're sort of in a thumbs down, kind of frowny face regulatory environment, as we all know. So I was kind of glad I had one of these, but even if we didn't have one of those, I could have looked at lots of other informational sources. This one, that one, that one, that one. And in fact, I did. So that I actually didn't even drive the car that I ultimately purchased because I had so much information about this car, for this particular car, that I didn't even feel the need to take that particular model out for a spin. Now, is the market for automobiles a perfect market? Absolutely not. Is it a information-governed market? To a substantial extent, yes. Are people largely satisfied with the information ecosystem describing the purchase of automobiles? I would suggest that the answer is yes. And if you doubt me, if you doubt where this came from, we could go back to this Nobel Prize-winning economist who explained famously 50 years ago just why market asymmetries were so politically fragile and why institutional systems tended to be built to mediate them. I'll stop there.
It's a great presentation. Is this on? Yeah. Excellent presentation. Really. Yeah. Okay. Hello. Well, I just have a quick question for you. I mean, we chatted last night at dinner, and I'm intrigued by this idea that elite universities can have a role to play in helping to train and educate the underemployed and people who have been marginalized by this new technology. But what are the ways in which they can do that? If I want to go back to Boston College and talk to my dean about what an inspiring talk I heard from you, what should I suggest to him about how we can get engaged in this?
Yeah, and this is, and I'm going to skewer myself the way I skewered Heather McGowan. I think that these are not conceptual puzzles. These are collective action problems, essentially. So whose problem is the lifelong education of underemployed adults in the United States? Whose problem is that, right? How do we claim responsibility for it? How do we measure progress toward its amelioration? And who's going to pay for it? And I would suggest that the elite public and private universities with some degree of fungible resources are in a position to take some responsibility for that problem. I am not optimistic that they'll take it all by themselves. They might be asked to assume partnership in addressing this problem. I think one of the things that the highly selective schools might do is develop some new product lines for classes of categories of persons whom they haven't typically thought of as their potential clients. But I think the other thing they could do is play a role in creating data infrastructures, data governance, interoperability standards, mechanisms whereby providers of post-secondary credentials that are not colleges and universities might say, we think we're doing a good thing, we're not sure how well we are performing, we're not going to know about the relative value of our particular instructional program over a short period of time. We'd like to find mechanisms for cooperating with researchers to observe the relative value of credentials and the evolution of this marketplace over time. The goal would be who's going to take responsibility for building a market apparatus that will distribute risk a little bit more equitably. I think a few universities are in a position to be called upon to assist the country in that task. That's as far as I've gotten.
Affiliated with a university not unlike Stanford. I'm part of the faculty of the business school, not tenured. And I would readily be run out of town on a rail if this was repeated. But there's a debate that has raged as recently as the other day about whether the focus of the school and its faculty ought to be research or whether it ought to be more pragmatically positioned in the context of encouraging leadership skills and forward skills and that sort. And so a very highly placed faculty member who's in an administrative position bridled at the notion that the school would be a trade school. Mm-hmm. When someone like me pointed out that in some respects, that's exactly what we should be. A trade school. We don't necessarily have to train people how to weld things, but we have to train people how to be successful in their own right and how to be able to promulgate success in others. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I guess I would say, I'm not just looking to research universities. I mean, the last place I would look for rapid movement is in well-resourced research universities, right? They have very little incentive to change. I'm actually very enthusiastic about mobilizing private capital and very large firms. My colleague Candace Till, for example, recently announced that she's leaving Stanford to go to Amazon to help them build their bespoke intramural instructional program for the ongoing skill enhancement of all of their workers. All education beyond high school is a data anarchy, okay? It's a giant world of nobody knows, right? We know there's a great deal of positive return to those who finish four-year degrees at schools in the top 20% of the US News and World Report ranking systems. That's it, right? After that, it's the Wild West. I think the absence of ground truth actually may inhibit long-term profitability for venture capital as well. And I think responsible leadership, investors who are thinking in the middle term about what kind of marketplace they would like to be building and participating in is another way that we could look for assistance. And then the universities could be called on to make whatever contribution that might be appropriate for their missions.
So my name's Deborah Goodings. I'm from National Science Foundation, but this is not an NSF question. So my second question is, how are MOOCs working out? But my first question is, about a year ago, in the New York Times, they said that half of registered Republicans felt that college was not just neutral. They thought it had a negative effect on the people who went there. Mm-hmm. To me, this is a real wake-up call, not just for Stanford, it is for all places of higher education. So if you can find time to do both of those, maybe one of those is
well, amen to the latter, right? I do think that basically the universities we have become implicated in the class war, all right? I mean, throughout the Cold War period, elite universities stood above the fray of the class war and the class conflict, and they actually strategically positioned themselves as mediators of class inequality by creating new forms of opportunity for wide swaths of Americans. We have been pulled into the narrative of categorical conflict, and I think actually that creates opportunities for new forms of storytelling for the universities that enjoy the most privilege in the ecosystem at present. I think actually it gives me some optimism for how some of the how our schools might be called upon by others in the polity to make new contributions. MOOCs are MOOCs. They were never anything other than MOOCs. The people who created them, who created versions of them at Stanford in 2010, never imagined that they would solve all of the world's problems. The Silicon Valley hype machine paid attention to the fact that Stanford, MIT, and Harvard were doing something at exactly the same time. I think they were a blip in the history of digitally mediated instruction. They did change the conversation on campuses like my own. I'll stop there.
Now you can hear me. Okay, so why are there so many liberal arts colleges and so very few Republican arts colleges? That was a joke.
It's a great question.
That was the previous question asked in a new way. But here comes the real question.
It's a great question.
Yeah, so...
Not a great joke.
Viviana can trust you. So the real question is, Stanford has a brand strategy that is, characteristic for selection, exclusivity. It's the campus that's branded. There's not very much online. If you're on campus, you're king, right? and then there's 5% acceptance rate. So what would you say would be a plausible brand strategy for Stanford to approach the large amount of undereducated people?
I'm actually not interested in having that conversation. To me, places like Stanford are giant chunks of civic capacity. You should tell us what we all should do with Stanford, right? We have forgotten that universities are grand mechanisms for collaboration and partnership, right? Herbert Hoover figured this out early and well. Research universities are joint ventures between national, state, and federal governments and exceptionally generous private philanthropists. Make us an offer, right? Sit us down and have a conversation with the most powerful, most prestigious universities in the country, and ask us what we can do for the future of work. I'm frankly not interested in Stanford's brand strategy.
But if I may ask, I mean, the issue is that they have to do, and this is not specifically about Stanford, I would say the elite universities are trapped, and they're trapped in the prestige competition. And the poverty of data, the fact that we are in some sense like a bazaar, and there is information asymmetry, and we have not done anything to ameliorate it, gave third parties to create the ranking games, okay, in which they control the prestige. And we have just went along with it instead of saying, for example, no, we will not give you the data. We could do that, but we're not doing it. And so, and now the prestige game is the thing that fits on itself, because we think to attract faculty, we need to be prestigious. To attract graduates, we need to be prestigious. To attract philanthropy, we need to be prestigious. And serving the underemployed, undereducated masses does not fit in the prestige competition.
Yeah, so here's the big trick. Universities are driven by their patrons. If our most generous patrons would ask our schools to do new things for the nation, we would pay attention. I would say that what we're trapped in is that the elites we are winning by the 20th century rules of the game, and our patrons are rewarding us for winning that game. They are not challenging us to play a new game. The moment the philanthropy shows up, we will start paying attention. You'll pay a tax, but we'll listen.
On that note, thank you very much.